June 1718. The dungeons of the Trubetskoy Bastion, inside the Peter and Paul fortress. The air itself seems compressed, thick with centuries of dampness, despair, and the faint metallic scent of blood. In the dim torchlight, casting jerky, monstrous shadows on the wet stone walls, the final act of the Romanov dynasty's greatest tragedy unfolds. On the floor, lying on filthy straw, is a man barely recognizable as the heir to the Russian throne. His body is a parchment detailing the story of his fall, written by the hands of torturers. But the most terrifying instrument of all stands nearby, never touching him. It is his father. The Emperor of all Russia, Peter Alexeyevich. A giant well over 6 feet tall, his figure blocks almost all the light. His face, usually so animated, is now a mask of dark granite. Only his famous eyes burn with a cold, calculating fire. He does not shout. He speaks quietly, which makes his voice even more terrifying. Every question that leaves his lips is not an attempt to find the truth, but the crack of a whip, forcing the required answer. Here, in this freezing hell, it is not merely a father and son confronting each other. It is a head-on collision of two Russias. One is the Russia of the future, a nation Peter is building like a mad architect from blood, sweat, and tears on the Neva swamps. A Russia of ships, assemblies, a regular army, and a ruthless state machine. The other is the Russia of the past, personified by his son, Alexei. A Russia of quiet monasteries, boyar chambers, long church services, and a sleepy patriarchal life. Peter looks at his son and sees not his own blood, but the ghost of the Streltsy rebellion, the shadow of his sister Sophia, the whisper of conspiring boyars. He sees a hydra of treason, and to save his greatest creation, the empire, he must burn this hydra to the ground, even if it bears his name and his features. The main question, echoing off the vaulted ceiling, is no longer whether the Tsarevich is guilty. The question is why this great builder, a man who literally shaped a new country with his bare hands, is so methodically destroying the one who was meant to be its protector. The answer is born here, in the silence between the Tsar's questions and his heir's groans. For Peter, the state has become a god, and he is its high priest, willing to place any sacrifice upon its altar, even this one. To understand the depth of this tragedy, we must travel back half a century, to the world Peter sought so furiously to destroy. Muscovite Rus in the second half of the 17th century was a vast, slumbering tsardom, isolated from the rest of Europe, less by geography than by its mindset. Its western borders were pressed by aggressive and technologically advanced powers, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, still remembering its days of greatness, and the Swedish Empire, which had turned the Baltic into a Swedish lake and held the entire northern coast in an iron grip. From the south loomed the shadow of the sublime Porte and its vassal, the Crimean Khanate, whose raids devastated the Russian lands. Russia had no access to either the Baltic or the Black Seas, strangling its trade and cutting off direct contact with European civilization. Inside the country, time itself seemed to have frozen. Life was defined not by laws and reforms, but by ancient customs and the church calendar. The boyar aristocracy, obsessed with their lineage, wore long beards and robes that seemed barbaric to Europeans, engaging in endless petty disputes over precedence, placing their family honor above the interests of the state. Women of the upper classes lived in total seclusion in their terems, their world limited to the home and the church. The army, consisting of a noble levy and the unreliable, mutinous Streltsy regiments, was hopelessly outdated compared to the regular armies of Europe. Education was the privilege of the clergy, and printing was confined mostly to religious texts. The great religious schism, initiated by Patriarch Nikon, had sown deep discord in the spiritual life of the people, giving rise to the Old Believers, a powerful conservative movement that saw the seal of the Antichrist in any innovation. This was a country closed in on itself, suspicious of all things foreign, living at its own slowed-down rhythm. It was into this world, saturated with the smell of incense and wax, a world where a beard was a sign of piety and shaving a mortal sin, that Peter erupted. He was not merely a product of this era, he was its antithesis, its complete negation. He saw in this slumber not piety, but a mortal sickness, and he made it his life's goal to awaken Russia, even if it meant using the most brutal and painful methods. Peter's drama was embedded in him from birth, in the very structure of his family and dynasty. His father, Tsar Alexei, known as the Most Pious for his gentle and non-confrontational nature, was married twice. His first wife, Maria Miloslavskaya, bore him 13 children, including the future Tsars Fyodor and Ivan, as well as the ambitious and intelligent Tsarevna Sofia. After her death, Alexei married a second time, to the young and spirited Natalia Narishkina, who became Peter's mother. From that moment, the royal court transformed into a viper's nest, where two powerful clans, the Miloslavskis and the Narishkins, waged a war in the shadows for influence over the Tsar and the future of the throne. Peter, as the firstborn of the Narishkin party, was a trump card in this game from infancy. When Tsar Alexei died in 1676, the sickly Fyodor, a son from the first marriage, ascended the throne. His brief reign only heightened the tension. The death of the childless Fyodor in 1682 was the detonator that ignited the powder keg. Formally, the next in line was the feeble-minded and ailing Ivan, but the Narishkin party seized the moment, proclaiming the 10-year-old, healthy, and robust Peter as Tsar. This was a direct challenge to the Miloslavskis and their informal leader, Tsarevna Sofia. Sofia, possessing a sharp mind and an unwomanly thirst for power, had no intention of yielding. She used the discontent of the Streltsy, the elite regiments of the Moscow garrison, to stage a coup. The result of the bloody rebellion, witnessed by the young Peter, was a compromise. Two Tsars, Ivan and Peter, were crowned simultaneously, while real power passed into the hands of Sofia as regent. Peter and his mother, Natalia, were effectively exiled from the Kremlin to the nearby village of Preobrazhenskoye. This exile would define him. He grew up far from the suffocating atmosphere of Kremlin intrigue, but with the sharp awareness that his life was in constant danger and his right to the throne was contested by powerful enemies. The shadow of Sofia, the shadow of the Miloslavskis, the shadow of a perpetually lurking threat. This is what forged his character, teaching him to trust no one and to rely only on force. As is often the case with figures of this magnitude, Peter's birth and childhood were shrouded in myths and omens, which in hindsight were interpreted as signs of his great and terrible destiny. Popular rumor, always drawn to the miraculous, connected his arrival with unusual celestial phenomena. It was said that on the night Tsarina Natalia gave birth, a bright comet was seen over Moscow, a sure sign in the minds of the time of coming great changes, wars, and upheavals. His physical attributes were exceptional from the start. He was born a surprisingly large and robust child, and by his youth, his height approached 7 feet, making him a head taller than anyone in his circle. This physical power, combined with his restless energy, inspired both admiration and fear. In a conservative religious environment that valued humility and propriety, Such an untamed, almost elemental prince seemed an anomaly. To some, he was a bogatyr, a heroic warrior sent by God to protect the Russian land. To others, especially adherents of the old ways and the old believers, he was a harbinger of the apocalypse, the Antichrist himself. His fascination with German amusements, his interest in crafts, his friendship with foreigners from the German quarter, all of this, in their eyes, was the devil's mark, a retreat from the true faith and ancestral traditions. These rumors and prophecies created a unique aura around Peter. He was not seen as just another Romanov. From the beginning, he was an eschatological figure, destined to either save Russia or destroy it. This mythological trail would follow him all his life, amplifying both the devotion of his supporters and the hatred of his enemies. Peter himself, a pragmatic man far from mysticism, nonetheless intuitively understood the power of this myth. Perhaps he even believed in his own special mission, that fate or providence itself had laid upon him the titanic task of redrawing the map of the world and the history of his country. This belief in his own destiny gave him the strength to overcome any obstacle and justified, in his own eyes, any cruelty. If there was a single moment that can be called the forge of his character, it was undoubtedly the bloody events of May 1682. The 10-year-old boy, just proclaimed Tsar over his older brother, found himself at the epicenter of one of the most brutal riots in Moscow's history. Fueled by rumors spread by the Miloslavsky party that the Narishkins had murdered Tsarevich Ivan, enraged mobs of Streltsy stormed the Kremlin. Before Peter's and his mother's eyes, a horrific slaughter unfolded. He stood on the red porch of the Palace of Facets and watched as the Streltsy seized his uncle, Afanasy Narishkin, and threw him down onto the pikes below. He saw them tear apart Prince Mikhail Dolgorukov and the boyar Artamon Matveyev, his mentor and a friend of the family. The blood of his relatives and loved ones flowed on the Kremlin cobblestones. This primal terror, this feeling of complete helplessness before the blind, savage fury of the mob, was forever seared into his memory. This day taught him several fundamental things. First, it created in him a deep, almost physiological revulsion for the traditional Russian elite and for Moscow as its symbol. The bearded boyars, unable to protect him, and the drunk, wild Streltsy merged in his mind into a single image of stagnant, barbaric force that had to be either subjugated or destroyed. Second, this experience laid the foundation for his future paranoia. He understood that power not backed by a loyal and personally devoted military force was a fiction. He could trust no one. That is why, when exiled to Preobrazhenskoye, he did not waste time on court intrigues. He began to create his own army, his famous play regiments, which at first seemed like a child's game, very quickly turned into real European-trained guards regiments, the Preobrazhensky and the Semyonovsky. These were not just soldiers. They were his men, his support, his answer to the horror of the Streltsy rebellion. In this game of soldiers, not only was a new Russian army being forged, but also a new type of ruler, an autocrat, whose will was the only law, backed by the bayonets of his guardsmen. The first real test, where the play games turned into high-stakes state policy, was the Azov campaigns of 1695 and 1696. The goal was to capture the Turkish fortress of Azov at the mouth of the Don River, which would give Russia access to the Sea of Azov and, potentially, the Black Sea. This was the young Tsar's first independent military project, his claim to real power after overthrowing Sophia's regency. And the first campaign ended in a complete and humiliating failure. The Russian army, still composed of noble cavalry and Streltsy regiments, demonstrated its total incompetence in besieging a modern fortress. the lack of unified command, poor discipline, and, most importantly, the absence of a fleet to blockade Azov from the sea doomed the enterprise. The Turks easily brought in reinforcements and supplies by water. After several failed assaults, the Russians were forced to retreat, having suffered heavy losses. For any other ruler of that time, this might have been the end of a career. But it was here that Peter's unique character revealed itself. Defeat did not break him. It only fueled his stubbornness and energy. He did what seemed unthinkable. Returning to Moscow, he launched a gigantic construction project in Voronezh on the Don River. In a single winter, in a country with no seafaring traditions, no experienced engineers, and no skilled workers, an entire flotilla of several dozen galleys and 2 large ships was built. He himself worked as a carpenter, setting an example. He rounded up thousands of peasants for the shipyards. He invited foreign specialists. He acted with a truly demonic obsession. And in the spring of 1696, a completely different army, accompanied by a fleet, set out for the Second Azov Campaign. Blockaded from land and sea, Azov fell. This was not just a military victory, it was a triumph of one man's will. Peter had proven to himself and the country that nothing was impossible if enough effort was applied. The Azov campaigns taught him the most important lesson. The old Russia was incapable of solving new problems. To win, it was necessary to build ships, cast modern cannons, train soldiers, and, above all, break age-old traditions and stagnation. This experience became the prologue to all his future, far more massive reforms. Behind all of Peter's great deeds, his reforms, wars, and constructions, there was a powerful internal engine, a secret motivation that could be called his civilizing complex. This complex was finalized during his famous Grand Embassy to Europe in 1697 and 98. Traveling incognito as a simple sergeant, Peter Mikhailov, he saw with his own eyes the world he had previously only read about and heard of from foreigners in the German quarter. And this world stunned him. He saw the shipyards of Holland and England, where massive ocean-going vessels were built. He saw the arsenals, where the world's best weapons were produced. He visited manufactories, observatories, and anatomical theaters. He saw cities with paved streets, multi-story buildings, and complex systems of governance. And comparing all this with what he had left at home, he felt not just curiosity or admiration. He felt a burning, unbearable shame. Shame for the long beards of his boyars, for their ignorance and arrogance. Shame for the backwardness of the Russian army, for the absence of a fleet, for the wooden, filthy Moscow. This shame became the fuel for his transformative fury. He returned to Russia not just with new knowledge and hired specialists. He returned with a firm, almost fanatical conviction that Russia needed to be saved from itself. It had to be forcibly, against its will, dragged out of the Middle Ages and made into a great European power. In his mind, a complete identification of himself with the state had occurred. Russia became his personal project, his workshop, and its people, the raw material from which he would sculpt a new nation. Therefore, he perceived any resistance to his reforms not as a difference of opinion, but as a personal insult and state treason. When he personally cut the beards of the boyars after returning from Europe, it was not just a symbolic act. It was a declaration of war on the old world. He had no intention of negotiating or persuading. He intended to break it over his knee. And this obsession, this belief that only he knew the one true path and that any price for moving along it was acceptable, became the source of both his greatest achievements and his most terrible crimes. He was building the future, but in the process, he was ready to destroy anyone who, in his opinion, threatened that future. The beginning of the 18th century marked Russia's entry into the Great Northern War, a 21-year conflict that became the harshest test of endurance for Peter's reforms and for the country itself. Peter, in alliance with Denmark and Saxony, challenged the young Swedish king, Charles XII, hoping to win back access to the Baltic Sea from Sweden. The very first major battle of this war, near Narva in November of 1700, turned into a catastrophe for the Russian army. Using a heavy blizzard that blew into the faces of the Russian soldiers, Charles attacked with a much smaller force and utterly routed Peter's huge, but poorly trained and ineptly commanded army. The losses were monstrous. All the artillery was lost, and many foreign officers, led by the commander-in-chief, the Duc de Croix, surrendered. Europe wrote Russia off, and Charles XII, convinced of his own invincibility, went to fight in Poland, believing the Russians were finished. This moment, known as the Narva disgrace, was for Peter what the failure of the First Azov campaign had been, but on an immeasurably larger scale. It was rock bottom, from which he could only push off. And Peter once again showed the world his titanic will. He did not fall into despair. He locked himself in his residence and for several days developed a plan of action. The entire country was turned into a military camp. A new recruitment draft was announced, pulling thousands of peasants from the villages and turning them into soldiers. To replace the lost artillery, Peter ordered the bells to be removed from churches and monasteries and melted down into cannons, an unheard-of sacrilege in the eyes of the faithful. Dozens of new taxes were introduced, levying on everything from bathhouses to beards. He understood that Charles had given him a breathing spell, and he used this time with maximum efficiency. While the Swedish king was bogged down in Poland, Peter, step by step, won back territory from the Swedes in Ingria at the mouth of the Neva River. He built a new army, trained new officers, and created a military industry in the Urals. Narva was a cruel but most important lesson for him. It taught him that half measures would not suffice. To defeat a modern military machine like Sweden's, the entire state had to be rebuilt, subordinating the life of the whole country to a single goal: victory in the war. In the midst of the grueling Northern War, when its outcome was still completely uncertain, Peter committed an act that seemed like pure madness to his contemporaries and like brilliant foresight to posterity. In May of 1703, on the swampy islands in the Neva Delta, won back from the Swedes, he founded a fortress named in honor of his patron saint, St. Petersburg. Soon, a city began to grow alongside the fortress. This was not just the founding of a new settlement. It was a civilizational manifesto, thrown in the face of both his enemies and history itself. Peter was building his new capital not in the center of the country, like Moscow, but on its very outskirts, on what was essentially enemy territory, under constant threat of Swedish attack. He built it on deadly swamps, where people died in droves from disease, hunger, and inhuman working conditions. Tens of thousands of peasants rounded up from all over the country and captured Swedes literally laid down their bones in the foundation of this city. St. Petersburg was a city of paradox from the very beginning. It was built not for people, but for an idea. This was the idea of a new Russia, maritime, military, European, and open to the world. Its architecture was the complete opposite of the chaotic and curved lines of Moscow. Straight as an arrow avenues, symmetrical ensembles, strict classical facades. All this was the embodiment of the rational, ordered world that Peter sought to impose on his barbaric country. The city was built as a port and a shipyard. Its main street was the Neva River. Its heart was the Admiralty. It was conceived as a window to Europe, through which Western technology, culture, and ideas were to flow into Russia. But at the same time, This window also became an opening through which Russia itself looked at Europe, no longer as a supplicant, but as a formidable military power, supported by the Baltic Fleet, which was being born right here on the Neva shipyards. By forcing the aristocracy to move from cozy Moscow to the unsettled, cold, and dangerous Petersburg, Peter was forcibly tearing them from their old roots, tying them to his new project. The city, built on bones, became the symbol and the main achievement of his era, the stone embodiment of his iron will, which disregarded any sacrifice for the sake of achieving a great goal. The years following the Narva disaster were a time of persistent labor and strategic power building for Peter. While Charles XII was chasing the Polish King Augustus II across the Commonwealth, trying to place his own puppet, Stanisław Leszczyński, on the throne, Peter methodically strengthened his position in the Baltics. He did not seek a decisive battle, understanding that his new army was not yet ready for a direct confrontation with the best army in Europe. Instead, he used small war tactics, wearing down Swedish garrisons, capturing fortresses, and gradually accustoming his soldiers to victory. The key moment, which showed that the Russian army had learned to beat the Swedes, was the Battle of Lesnaya on September 28, 1708. A flying corps under Peter's personal command attacked and destroyed a massive supply train led by General Lewenhaupt, which was moving to join Charles's main army on its way to Moscow. The Swedes lost thousands of soldiers and, most importantly, all their food and ammunition for 3 months. Peter later called this victory the mother of the Battle of Poltava, and he was right. Deprived of his supply train, Charles XII was forced to abandon his march on Moscow and turn south to Ukraine, hoping for help from Hetman Mazepa and to winter in a warmer climate. This decision proved fatal for him. Peter used a brutal and brilliant strategy of scorched earth against him. While retreating, Russian troops destroyed everything in their path, leaving a devastated, empty territory for the Swedish army. The harsh winter of 1708 to 1709, one of the coldest in European history, finished the job. The Swedes suffered from hunger, frost, and constant partisan attacks. Their great army melted away before their eyes. This strategic patience, this willingness to sacrifice his own territory to weaken the enemy, this ability to impose his will on the opponent and lure him into a trap, all this demonstrated that Peter had transformed from an impulsive student into a cold-blooded and calculating grand master of war. He was ready for the decisive battle. In the complex and cruel world Peter was building, people were divided into 2 categories: tools for achieving his goals and obstacles to be eliminated. Among the tools, the most important were the fledglings of Peter's nest, men he raised from obscurity and made the pillars of his regime, valuing not their noble birth, but their loyalty, energy, and efficiency. The most striking example was Alexander Menshikov, a former pie seller who became a serene prince, a generalissimus, and the second most powerful man in the state. Of low birth, prone to theft, but immensely talented and boundlessly loyal to the Tsar, Menshikov was the living embodiment of Peter's new elite. Another such figure was his second wife, Marta Skavronskaya, a Livonian peasant woman captured by Russian troops, who went from being a soldier's mistress to the Tsar's lover, and finally, to Empress Catherine I. Peter valued in her not beauty or intellect, but a lively, practical mind, emotional stability, and the ability to calm his fits of rage. They were his new family, his support. But this new family had a dark side, his old family, his first wife, Eudoxia Lopakina, whom he despised and forcibly tonsured as a nun, and most importantly, his son from this marriage, Tsarevich Alexei. Alexei Petrovich was the complete opposite of his father. Raised in Moscow, surrounded by clergy and the old boyar nobility. While his father was at war and building Petersburg, he had absorbed the spirit of pré-Petrine Rus. He was pious, disliked military affairs, and loathed his father's loud, drunken assemblies. His ideal was the quiet, devout life of a Moscow sovereign, not the fate of a soldier and shipbuilder on the throne. As Peter's reforms became more radical and brutal, and as discontent grew among the people and the old aristocracy, Alexei involuntarily became a center of gravity for all opposition forces. People who hated Petersburg, the shaving of beards, the recruitment drafts, and the taxes, looked to the Tsarevich as their future savior, who upon ascending the throne would return everything to the old ways. On the geopolitical stage, Peter's main antagonist was, of course, King Charles XII of Sweden. A brilliant commander, stubborn and proud, he was the perfect rival for the Tsar. Their confrontation became the backbone of the entire Northern War. The irony was that Peter eventually defeated his great external enemy, while his greatest internal enemy, as it seemed to him, was growing up in his own home. Even at the height of his power, Peter was not safe from crushing defeats that demonstrated the fragility of his imperial project. One of the most humiliating moments of his life was the Pruth campaign of 1711. After the victory at Poltava, Charles XII fled to the Ottoman Empire, where he actively incited the Sultan to war against Russia. Eventually, he succeeded. Peter, underestimating his opponent and overestimating his own strength, decided on a preemptive strike and moved his army into Moldavia, counting on the support of the local Orthodox population. This calculation proved completely wrong. He received no support, and his army, having advanced deep into enemy territory, was confronted by a massive Turkish Tatar army that outnumbered it several times over. On the Pruth River, the Russian army was completely surrounded and pinned against the water. The situation was catastrophic. Ammunition and food were running out, and the water sources were in enemy hands. The Russian soldiers faced either total annihilation or shameful captivity. Peter himself, according to eyewitnesses, was in a state bordering on despair. He paced the camp, unable to give orders, and prepared for the worst. Everything he had created over years of titanic labor, the new army, the status of a great power, the fruits of Poltava, all of it could be destroyed in a single day. In this critical moment, according to a common, though not fully confirmed story, his companion, the future Empress Catherine, played a decisive role. She gathered all the jewelry she and the officers possessed and gave it to the Vice-Chancellor Shafirov to bribe the Grand Vizier, Baltasha Mehmet Pasha. Whether the bribe worked or the Vizier himself did not want to risk his army in a pitched battle against desperate Russians, the Turks agreed to negotiate. Peace was concluded on humiliating terms for Russia. It returned Azov to the Turks, demolished the fortress of Taganrog, and pledged not to interfere in Polish affairs. It was a huge step backward. But the Pruth campaign was an important lesson for Peter. It showed that even after the greatest triumph, one could find oneself on the edge of an abyss, and that the fate of the empire depended not only on the strength of arms, but also on diplomatic flexibility, and sometimes on simple luck. This experience, perhaps, further strengthened his paranoid conviction that he could never relax, not even for a second, and that a threat could come from any direction. The apogee of his military glory and the birthday of the Russian Empire as a great European power was the Battle of Poltava, which took place on June 27th, or July 8th, by the new calendar, 1709. By this point, the exhausted and depleted Swedish army of Charles XII was besieging the small fortress of Poltava in Ukraine. Peter decided to give a decisive battle here. He prepared for it meticulously. In front of the Russian fortified camp, a system of 10 redoubts, earthen fortifications, was built, designed to break up the Swedish battle formations and wear them down under crossfire. The Russian army now significantly outnumbered the Swedes, especially in artillery. Peter himself, despite having been wounded in the leg shortly before the battle, personally rode through the regiments, inspiring his soldiers. His famous address before the battle, in which he said that the soldiers were fighting not for Peter, but for the state entrusted to Peter and for their kin and their fatherland, has become legendary. The battle began early in the morning with a Swedish attack on the redoubts, breaking through them, but suffering heavy losses and losing their formation. The Swedish infantry clashed with the main forces of the Russian army. In a fierce battle, the new, trained, and disciplined Russian infantry withstood the charge of the famous Swedish Karelians and then launched a counter-offensive. The Swedish army, considered invincible for 100 years, was utterly routed and fled. Its remnants surrendered a few days later at Perevolozhna. Charles XII himself, along with Hetman Mazepa, miraculously managed to escape to Turkish territory. The triumph was absolute. Poltava changed everything. It instantly erased the shame of Narva and demonstrated the power of the new Russia to the entire world. The myth of Charles XII's invincibility was shattered. Sweden forever lost its status as a great power, and Russia took its place in the pantheon of European leaders. For Peter, this was the moment of supreme triumph. He had proven the correctness of his path. Like a biblical creator, he had fashioned a new army and a new country from chaos and backwardness, and this country had won a victory that shook the world. At that moment, he likely became fully convinced of his own infallibility and that his will was the will of history. This feeling of omnipotence, this victor's pride, or as the ancient Greeks called it, hubris, may have been the very point at which the path to tragedy begins. Convinced he could remake a country, he perhaps decided he also had the right to remake the destiny of his own son. While Peter forged his empire in the roar of cannons and the pounding of axes in the shipyards, a deep personal and dynastic drama was brewing in the shadow of his great deeds. Its center was his son and heir, Tsarevich Alexei. The conflict between father and son was not just a clash of two different personalities. It was a conflict of two civilizations. Peter was a man of action, a pragmatist, for whom the highest value was the usefulness to the state. He despised book learning if it had no practical application, and he saw in his son, above all, a future soldier, sailor, and statesman who would continue his work. Alexei was his complete opposite. Raised in Moscow by his mother, Eudoxia Lopukhina, and her circle, he grew up in an atmosphere of traditional Russian piety. He was inclined toward contemplation, loved church services, and read widely. But he absolutely could not stand military drills, sea voyages, and his father's loud, debauched feasts. Peter, eternally busy with war and reforms, took almost no part in his upbringing. When he did pay attention to him, it was only to demand, in a gruff, commanding tone, the impossible, that Alexei become a copy of himself. He forced his son to participate in military campaigns and sent him to study abroad. But all this only provoked rejection and fear in Alexei. He was afraid of his gigantic, short-tempered, unpredictable father. This fear made him lie, dodge, and feign illness, just to avoid his father's assignments. Peter saw this not as weakness of character, but as stubbornness, laziness, and a hidden hostility to his endeavors. Peter's letters to his son from this period are full of reproaches, threats, and disappointment. He writes, "It is better to have a good stranger than an evil son," hinting that he is prepared to disinherit him. This chasm between them deepened with each passing year. Alexei, seeking support and sympathy, found it in a circle of people dissatisfied with Peter's reforms, among disgraced clergy and the old aristocracy. Thus, the personal drama of father and son gradually grew into a political problem. The heir to the throne, without fully realizing it, was becoming a living banner for the opposition, a symbol of hope for a return to the old ways. And for Peter's paranoid mind, this was tantamount to conspiracy. By 1715, the conflict had reached a boiling point. Peter's second wife, Catherine, had given birth to a son, also named Peter. Although the infant was in poor health, his birth gave the Tsar a formal opportunity to change the order of succession. It was at this moment that Peter presented Alexei with his famous ultimatum. In a letter that read more like an indictment, he demanded for the last time that his son change. "I declare to you my final will, either correct your character and sincerely make yourself the heir, or be tonsured." He gave Alexei an impossible choice: either immediately transform into another person, become someone he was not and could not be, or renounce everything: the throne, secular life, his future, and enter a monastery. For the 25-year-old Tsarevich, who by that time already had his own son, the future Emperor Peter II, this was a devastating blow. Entering a monastery meant civil death and complete oblivion. An attempt to correct himself was doomed to failure, as he knew he could never meet his father's inhuman demands. Trapped in a no-win situation, terrified and desperate, Alexei yielded to the persuasions of his circle, who saw the end of all their hopes in his removal from power. Men like Alexander Kikin, one of Peter's former associates who had joined the opposition, whispered to him that his father would never forgive him anyway, and that the only way out was to flee. To flee to the protection of a European power and bide his time, to wait for his father's death, and then, with foreign support and internal opposition, to return and claim his rightful throne. This advice was fatal. Alexei, instead of choosing one of the two paths offered by his father, chose a third, the most terrible one: the path of open defiance and, in Peter's view, state treason. In the autumn of 1716, under the pretext of traveling to Carlsbad for medical treatment, Tsarevich Alexei fled Russia. This act turned a family quarrel into an international scandal and set in motion the chain of events that would lead inexorably to the tragic conclusion. The flight of the heir to the throne abroad was not just a personal insult to Peter. It was a blow to the very heart of his state system. He, who had spent 2 decades forcing Europe to respect and fear Russia, was now in a humiliating position. His own son was seeking asylum from his political rivals. Alexei headed to Vienna, to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI, who was the brother-in-law of his late wife. He asked the emperor for protection, claiming his father wanted to kill him and destroy his soul by forcing him to live against God's laws. For the European courts, this was a sensation and a unique opportunity. The heir to the rising power of Russia was walking right into their hands. He could be used as a powerful lever of pressure on Peter, as a potential banner for an intervention, or to support internal opposition in Russia in the event of the Tsar's death. Emperor Charles, though not daring to risk open conflict with Peter, granted Alexei asylum, hiding him first in the Tyrolean castle of Ehrenberg, and then in the Neapolitan fortress of San Telmo. For Peter, this escape was confirmation of his worst paranoid fears. He saw it not as the spontaneous act of a frightened son, but as a carefully planned conspiracy, with threads leading from abroad and from his enemies within. In his eyes, Alexei ceased to be a son. He became a state criminal, a traitor, who had colluded with the enemies of the fatherland. Peter's fury was boundless. He immediately launched a massive search operation, deploying the full power of his diplomacy and secret service. His agents were sent all over Europe, with orders to find the Tsarevich at any cost. The main role in this operation was assigned to one of the most cunning and ruthless men of Peter's era, the diplomat, Pyotr Tolstoy. His task was clear: find, persuade, deceive, but return the fugitive to Russia. Peter wrote to him that if Alexei resisted, he could be threatened with war against the emperor and public condemnation as a traitor. A ruthless hunt had begun, with not only Alexei's fate at stake, but the prestige of the Russian Empire. The mission entrusted to Pyotr Tolstoy and Guards Captain Alexander Rumyantsev was extremely delicate and complex. They needed not only to find the Tsarevich, but to convince him to return voluntarily, as forcibly capturing him on foreign soil could lead to war. After a long search, Peter's agents picked up Alexei's trail in Naples. What followed was a masterful psychological duel. Tolstoy, an experienced intriguer, began to work on the broken, lonely, and perpetually doubting Tsarevich. He used a full arsenal of means, from flattery and assurances of his father's love to direct threats. His main weapon was a letter from Peter himself. In it, the Tsar swore by God and the Last Judgment that if Alexei returned, he would forgive him and subject him to no physical punishment, allowing him to live in the countryside with his lover, the serf woman Yefrosinya. "But if you do not do this," Peter wrote, "then, as your sovereign, I declare you a traitor, and I will not forsake any means to treat you as a traitor and a defiler of your father, in which God will help me in my truth." It was a classic carrot-and-stick tactic. On one hand, the promise of the quiet, peaceful life Alexei so craved. On the other, the threat of public shame, church damnation, and inevitable retribution. Stranded in a foreign land, not receiving the decisive support from the Austrians he had counted on, and with Yefrosinya, who had also been bribed and intimidated by Tolstoy's men, pregnant with his child, she begged him to believe his father and return. The psychological pressure was unbearable. Alexei broke. He believed his father's sworn promises, hoping he could finally find peace. In early 1718, he left Naples and, accompanied by Tolstoy and Rumyantsev, began his final journey. Back to Russia, back to his doom. It was his fatal mistake. He underestimated the depth of his father's anger and failed to understand that for Peter, the sovereign, an oath meant nothing when the interests of the state, which he identified as his own, were at stake. Alexei's return to Moscow in February 1718 was staged as a grand political spectacle, intended to publicly humiliate the heir and demonstrate the unshakable power of the Tsar. In the Assumption Cathedral in the Kremlin, in the presence of high clergy and dignitaries, a pre-directed scene played out. Alexei, weeping, fell at his father's feet, begging forgiveness for his transgression. Peter gave a denunciatory speech, after which Alexei's official renunciation of the throne in favor of his younger half-brother, Tsarevich Peter Petrovich, was read aloud. It seemed the Tsar's promise would be kept. Alexei was forgiven, though stripped of his right to the throne. But this was only the beginning. For Peter, simple renunciation was no longer enough. His paranoid mind, poisoned by the fear of conspiracy, demanded blood. He needed to know who was behind his son's flight, who were the bearded ones, whispering treasonous advice, who in Russia was awaiting his return as a signal for revolt. Immediately after the ceremony in the Kremlin, the investigation into the case of Tsarevich Alexei began. The secret chancellery was established, a special body of political investigation headed by the Tsar's most trusted men, including Pyotr Tolstoy. The flywheel of repression began to spin rapidly. Dozens of people from Alexei's circle were arrested: his confessor, his close associates, even his former mother-in-law, the exiled Eudoxia Lopukina, who was accused of breaking her monastic vows. Interrogations began, which immediately escalated into the most brutal torture. People were hoisted on the strappado, beaten with the knout, and burned with hot irons to force confessions of a conspiracy against the Tsar. Peter himself often personally attended these tortures. His gigantic figure loomed in the twilight of the torture chambers as he asked the questions, demanding new names of accomplices. The country plunged into an atmosphere of sticky fear. Any careless word, any past contact with the Tsarevich could become grounds for arrest and an agonizing death. The promise of pardon given to his son was forgotten. The father gave way to the investigator, and the Tsar to the supreme executioner. Peter was not seeking real conspirators so much as the total eradication of all opposition, any hint of disagreement with his course. And his own son was to become the chief witness for the prosecution in this terrifying trial. Initially, Peter may not have planned to physically destroy his son. He wanted to break his will, beat all the names of accomplices out of him, and permanently isolate him from society, perhaps in a monastery. But the course of the investigation and Alexei's own testimony changed everything. At first, the Tsarevich tried to deny the existence of a conspiracy, speaking only of his desire to withdraw from affairs. But when he himself was brought to the Peter and Paul fortress and subjected to interrogation with prejudice, his will was finally broken. Under torture, he began to give confused and contradictory testimony. He confessed that he had wished for his father's death. He said that during his flight, he had hoped for help from the Austrian emperor, who, he claimed, had promised him an army to win the Russian throne. He implicated dozens of people, many of whom were likely innocent. Each such confession, extracted under torture, looked to Peter like irrefutable proof of a wide-ranging treason. He saw what he wanted to see. His son was not just a lost sheep, but the leader of a dangerous conspiracy, ready to sell Russia to foreign powers to reverse all his transformations. At that moment, a final break occurred in Peter's mind. He no longer saw his son in the man being tortured in the dungeon. He saw an enemy of the state, a mortal threat to his entire life's work. He understood that as long as Alexei was alive, even locked in the most secure prison, he would remain a symbol of hope for all the discontented in the country. His name would be a banner for any future rebellion or palace coup. The threat of a restoration of the old order would not disappear as long as the carrier of this idea, the legitimate heir by blood, was alive. Peter concluded that to save the future of the empire, he must destroy its past, even if that past was embodied in his firstborn son. It was a terrible, monstrous decision, but from the perspective of his merciless state logic, was the only possible one. The interests of the state, as he understood them, demanded this sacrifice. Personal feelings, paternal love, the bonds of blood, all had to be laid on the altar of the empire he was creating. To give the execution of his son a veneer of legality, Peter took an unprecedented step. He did not pass sentence by his own autocratic will, although he had every right to do so. He decided to shift the formal responsibility onto the shoulders of the entire ruling elite. A Supreme Court was convened, composed of 127 men, all the members of the Senate, the Synod, the presidents of the colleges, generals, and the highest officials of the empire. These were the fledglings of Peter's nest, men who owed the Tsar everything. Their task was not to investigate the case, but merely to legitimize the decision Peter had already made. The protocols of the interrogations and the confessions extracted from Alexei under torture were laid out before them. Peter himself addressed the judges with a letter, detailing his son's crimes and asking them to deliver their verdict without partiality, not fearing to offend him if they, by chance, found Alexei innocent. This was a pure formality, a cruel irony. Everyone understood perfectly well what decision the Tsar expected. Anyone who dared to speak in the Tsarevich's defense would have immediately found himself on the strappado. The trial was swift and predictable. On June 24, 1718, all 127 judges unanimously found Tsarevich Alexei Petrovich guilty of high treason, of intent to overthrow his father, and of conspiracy to seize power with foreign military aid. The verdict was unequivocal: death. Legally, it was all settled. The son was condemned not by the will of a tyrant father, but in the name of the state, by a court of its highest representatives. Peter had gotten what he wanted. He had the formal right to execute his own heir, and this execution was meant to be a terrible lesson to all who dared, even in their thoughts, to oppose his will. It was meant to sear away the very idea of resistance by showing that in the face of state necessity, no barriers existed for him, not even the most sacred and natural ones, like the bond of blood between a father and son. Alexei's fate was sealed. All that remained was to carry out the sentence. The end of this tragedy was as dark and mysterious as the entire affair. An official execution ceremony never took place. 2 days after the death sentence was pronounced, on June 26, 1718, it was announced that Tsarevich Alexei had died in his cell in the Peter and Paul fortress. The official cause of death was an apoplectic stroke, supposedly brought on by the horror of having the death sentence read to him again. However, few believed this version then, and few believe it now. Too much evidence, both direct and circumstantial, indicates that the heir to the throne did not die a natural death. According to the most widespread and plausible version, even after the verdict, the interrogations and torture did not stop. Peter, obsessed with uncovering every thread of the conspiracy, continued to demand new confessions from his son. On the day of his death, Alexei was twice subjected to torture with the knout, receiving a total of 40 lashes. It is likely that his mangled and weakened body simply could not withstand these tortures. Some sources claim that Peter was personally present at this final session, and perhaps even took part. Thus, the finale was both ironic and terrible. Peter, who had sought to frame the execution as a lawful act of state justice, ultimately became, in effect, the direct murderer of his son, not even waiting for a public execution. Fate preempted him, sparing him the necessity of publicly sending his own flesh and blood to the scaffold, but leaving him forever with the brand of filicide. Alexei died not as a state criminal under the executioner's axe, but as a tortured prisoner in a damp dungeon, at the hands of his own jailers, acting on his father's orders. This mysterious death within the walls of the fortress, the very symbol of Peter's new state, became a grim epilogue to their relationship. The great builder, who had erected this fortress as a bastion of his power, had turned it into a tomb for his heir, definitively burying not only his son, but also any hope of reconciliation between the old and the new Russia. Peter's own death, which followed 7 years after his son's, in January 1725, was as symbolic and full of legends as his entire life. He died an agonizing death from a kidney disease, aggravated by the consequences of an old venereal disease. However, popular legend created a much more heroic myth about his demise. According to this legend, in the autumn of 1724, while returning to Petersburg across the Gulf of Finland, the Tsar saw a boat full of soldiers and sailors that had run aground. Without waiting for help, he unhesitatingly threw himself into the icy November water and personally took part in saving the men. It was after this, the story goes, that he caught the fatal inflammation that brought him to his grave. This legend, even if it doesn't align with historical facts, perfectly completes his image in the popular consciousness. The man who spent his life saving his state, building it, dragging it out of the swamp of backwardness, in his final act performs a personal sacrifice, saving common soldiers, the very material from which he sculpted his empire. This myth aligns perfectly with his paradoxical nature, a cruel tyrant who spared neither himself nor others, and at the same time, the father of the fatherland, ready to give his life for his subjects. His departure was as turbulent and chaotic as his reign. He died without clearly naming a successor. His famous decree on succession from 1722 had abolished the old order of transfer by direct male line, and gave the reigning monarch the right to appoint his own heir. With this decree, passed under the influence of Alexei's case, he had wanted to secure his life's work from unworthy successors. But he never had the chance to use this right himself. As he was dying, legend says, he asked for a pen and paper, but could only write 2 words. Give everything to. To whom remained a mystery. This unfinished sentence became a symbol of his legacy. He created a mighty empire, but left it without a clear mechanism for transferring power, dooming Russia to an entire era of palace coups, where the fate of the throne was decided not by laws, but by the bayonets of the Guards regiments, the very ones he had once created to protect his power. The legacy of Peter the Great is as grandiose, contradictory, and immense as his personality. On one hand, his achievements are indisputable and of civilizational significance. He transformed the backward, isolated Tsardom of Muscovy into the Russian Empire, one of the world's leading powers, which everyone now had to reckon with. He created from scratch a regular army and navy, which would ensure the country's military might for the next 2 centuries. He hacked a window to Europe by founding St. Petersburg and regaining Russia's access to the Baltic Sea, which gave a powerful impetus to trade and cultural exchange. Under his rule, a new system of state administration was created. The Senate, the colleges, the table of ranks was introduced, opening career paths to talented people regardless of their origin. He founded the Academy of Sciences, laying the foundation for secular education and science in Russia. He changed the very appearance of the country and its elite, forcing the nobility to serve, to learn, and to adopt European customs. But this coin had a dark side. The price of these transformations was monstrous. The reforms were carried out by barbaric methods, through violence, coercion, and the merciless exploitation of the people. The population of Russia during his reign shrank, by some estimates, by almost a quarter due to wars, the construction of cities and fortresses, and fleeing peasants. Serfdom, far from weakening, was intensified, turning peasants into the virtual property of landowners and the state. The tax burden reached unprecedented levels. Most importantly, his reforms created a profound cultural and mental schism in Russian society. The educated, Europeanized elite found itself cut off from the great mass of the people, who continued to live by traditional values. This divide, which began with Peter's transformations, would run like a red thread through all subsequent Russian history, becoming a source of endless disputes and social upheavals. Peter created a powerful, militarized, bureaucratic state, but this state became an end in itself, crushing the individual and standing immeasurably above the life and rights of any single person. This legacy proved to be as enduring as his great victories. And now, having traveled this bloody and great path, we can return to the main question, posed at the very beginning, in the damp dungeon of the Peter and Paul fortress. Why did the great creator become a filicide? The answer lies in the very essence of Peter's personality and his reforms. He did not execute his son, Alexei. He was performing a ritualistic murder of the past in the name of the future. In his consciousness, deformed by absolute power, childhood trauma, and decades of war, a complete fusion of his personality with the state had occurred. He was Russia. His will was its destiny. Any attack on his reforms was an attack on the very existence of the country. And his son, Alexei, by a twist of fate, became the living embodiment of everything Peter hated and tried to eradicate. He was the symbol of the old, boyar, superstitious, lazy Moscow. He was the walking ghost of pre-Petrine Rus. And as long as this ghost was alive, as long as he had a legal right to the throne, the entire grand edifice of the empire, built on bones and tears, remained under threat. Peter could tolerate opposition from the boyars. He could crush rebellions by streltsy and peasants, but he could not tolerate opposition in his own blood, in his direct heir. This was an existential threat. In this terrible dilemma of father or emperor, there was no room for compromise. To save the emperor and his work, the father had to die. And Peter made his choice. He sacrificed his son on the altar of his one true God, the state. This was not an act of blind rage. It was a cold-blooded, calculated, and, from his perspective, absolutely necessary political act. He cut out the gangrenous tumor to save the body of the empire. The paradox of Peter the Great is that his creative energy was inextricably linked to his destructive force. He could not build without breaking. He could not create the new without annihilating the old. And when the main symbol of that accursed old world became his own son, he, without hesitation, annihilated him too. This tragedy revealed the entire titanic and monstrous nature of his genius, a genius capable of birthing an empire and devouring his own child. The story of Peter and Alexei extends far beyond a family drama or a political murder. It is an eternal parable about the nature of power and the price of progress, one that sounds frighteningly relevant in any era. It confronts us with fundamental questions for which humanity has yet to find final answers. Can a great goal, such as building a powerful state or a bright future, justify any means, even the most inhuman? Where is the invisible line where a reformer genius turns into a mad tyrant, and the father of the nation becomes a Moloch, devouring his own children? Peter's story is a terrible warning about what happens when one person usurps the right to decide for everyone what the good is, and begins to tailor the living fabric of society to his own patterns, with no regard for tradition or human life. It is a story about the seduction of absolute power, which inevitably corrupts and deforms the mind, forcing it to see treason in any dissent, and an enemy to be destroyed in anyone who disagrees. The tragedy of Tsarevich Alexei is not just the tragedy of a weak man who stood in a titan's path. It is the tragedy of anyone who tries to preserve their individuality, their human essence, in the gears of a ruthless state machine, driven by the will of an obsessed leader. Peter hacked a window to Europe, but the draft from that window blew out much of what constituted Russia's soul, and the window frame itself was made of human bones. And looking at his figure across the centuries, we feel both admiration for his scale and horror at his cruelty. He remains the eternal Russian Sphinx, posing the same riddle. What is more important, the greatness of the state or the tear of a single tortured child? And history, it seems, has never given a comforting answer to that question.